Welcome to The Explainer. So, when you start digging into the reports surrounding the UAE's sudden departure from OPEC on May 1st, 2026, the sheer scale of this geopolitical earthquake becomes absolutely fascinating. We are looking at the sudden end of a 6-decade membership. Think about that for a second. 60 years of synchronized energy policy completely upended by a single press release. And what's wild here is that this isn't just some minor policy dispute or, a temporary supply adjustment. This is a massive structural fracture in one of the most powerful economic cartels in modern history. So, going through the data in the regional reports, I really wanted to explore the forces driving this alongside you. It's a move that has totally stunned energy markets and honestly forced us to fundamentally rethink the balance of power in the Middle East. Let's unpack the real catalyst behind this historic exit. To really grasp why this fracture happened right now, we have to start with a number that genuinely surprised me during the research. $50 billion. That's billion with a B. According to the financial models we're looking at, that is the estimated annual revenue the UAE was voluntarily leaving on the table every single year, just to comply with the rules of the OPEC cartel. When you contextualize that, $50 billion is enough to fund a major sovereign wealth fund's entire annual investment strategy. You could literally build out entire futuristic cities from scratch with that kind of cash. Now, for years, the UAE accepted this massive financial hit in the name of market stability and diplomatic unity. But recently, well, as you look at their domestic ambitions and expanding infrastructure, the math simply stopped making sense. The friction here really centers around what we can call the quota cage. For a nation that so closely tracks its output capabilities, the OPEC baseline calculations had become incredibly frustrating. The UAE has spent the last decade aggressively expanding its capacity to pump, taking on the massive risk and the huge capital expenditure. But under the cartel's strict limits, they found themselves completely blocked from leveraging those upgrades. It's essentially an economic trap. Imagine you do the heavy lifting to become a high-volume powerhouse, but the broader group locks you in a cage, capping your output just to support the struggling or less efficient members of the bloc. The UAE repeatedly pushed back on these outdated baseline metrics, and the frustration finally just boiled over. The math behind this quota cage is genuinely brutal. The UAE's official OPEC limit sat around 3.17 million barrels per day. But through their national oil company, ADNOC, the UAE has quietly poured an astonishing $132 billion since 2018 into expanding their actual production capabilities. And we aren't just talking about drilling a few extra holes in the sand, right? This capital went into massive offshore fields, cutting-edge extraction technologies, and heavy infrastructure upgrades. Today, they can realistically pump nearly 5 million barrels per day. They built this incredibly sophisticated high-capacity energy engine, but the cartel refused to let them turn the key. When the UAE petitioned for a major quota review to reflect this new reality, OPEC effectively told them to hold off until 2027. Clearly, Abu Dhabi decided they were done waiting.
Now you might be wondering, how could they afford to simply walk away from such a powerful group? Well, the answer lies in their economic diversification. Analyzing the economic breakdown, it's striking to see that 70% of the UAE's economy is now entirely non-oil and gas. Only 30% relies on fossil fuels. Over the past 2 decades, they have methodically built a resilient economic engine powered by global logistics, massive artificial intelligence investments, tourism, and financial services. It's fascinating to contrast this with their neighbor Saudi Arabia, whose Vision 2030 initiatives have faced recent funding struggles precisely because they still rely heavily on crude oil to fund the national budget. When global oil prices drop, Riyadh has to seriously worry about financing its megaprojects. But for the UAE, their massive ports, global airlines, and tech hubs keep generating revenue regardless of the price per barrel. They built the exit door long before they ever decided to walk through it.
But as you dig deeper into the reports, you realize the oil dispute is really just the surface level of this iceberg. What we're actually looking at is a quiet, multi-year geopolitical divorce between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. It's effectively a Gulf Cold War. For decades, Western analysts and policymakers operated on the firm assumption that Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were an unbreakable, unified bloc, that they moved in lockstep on almost everything. But reading through the regional intelligence from the past few years completely upends that assumption. These two nations have increasingly found themselves at odds, competing fiercely for regional dominance, economic supremacy, and geopolitical influence across the Middle East and Africa. Notice the escalation here when you map it out chronologically. It started back in 2019 with proxy disagreements in Yemen. Saudi Arabia was trying to restore the central government, while the UAE threw its weight behind southern separatist forces. Then, the following year, the UAE shocked the region by unilaterally signing the Abraham Accords with Israel, moving way ahead of Saudi Arabia's diplomatic timeline. Fast forward to 2024 and the conflict morphed into a direct corporate turf war.
with Saudi Arabia essentially strong-arming multinational corporations into moving their regional headquarters to Riyadh to challenge Dubai's dominance. But the real shocker hidden in the reports? That's late 2025. That is when Saudi airstrikes reportedly hit weapons shipments bound directly for UAE-backed forces in Yemen. This was a massive red line. They are no longer acting as allies. They are operating as direct competitors. This dynamic highlights a fundamental shift in the UAE's worldview, and it's perfectly captured by their diplomatic advisor, Anwar Gargash. He stated that strategic autonomy is the UAE's North Star. It's a fascinating concept. The core idea is that the UAE fundamentally refuses to rely on any single bloc, country, or alliance for its security and economic future. It dictates exactly how they will operate in a heavily fragmented multipolar world. They want the total freedom to negotiate bilateral deals with the US, China, Russia, and India all simultaneously, without needing anyone's permission. Remaining locked inside the rigid, collective rules of the OPEC cartel directly contradicted this newly adopted national doctrine. They simply outgrew the need for a chaperone.
So what actually happens to the global energy grid when a producer this large is suddenly free to pump? Well, when the UAE floods the market with that massive excess capacity, the dominoes start falling fast. You immediately see intense downward pressure pushing global crude prices near $50 a barrel, or potentially even lower. That cheap energy then quickly bleeds into cooling inflation metrics in major economies like the United States. As U.S. inflation drops, you start looking at Federal Reserve interest rate cuts, which traditionally impact the strength of the U.S. dollar. And there's a really surprising economic nuance the sources point out here. While a shifting dollar initially pressures gold prices downward, the sheer geopolitical instability caused by this massive cartel fracturing will likely drive investors right back into gold as a long-term safe haven. It's a ripple effect literally touching every corner of the global economy.
This brings up the ultimate question. Why pull the plug right now? Honestly, it really comes down to a race against the clock, specifically peak demand. Almost every major forecaster predicts that global demand for oil will hit its absolute peak sometime in the 2030s. Thanks to the rapid adoption of electric vehicles and massive global shifts in energy policy, demand is heading for a structural decline. If you are the UAE, every barrel of oil left in the ground after that peak risks becoming a stranded asset, an investment that loses its value forever. The UAE got spooked by the accelerating timeline of the energy transition. They are rushing to monetize their vast reserves before the music stops, realizing that in a world of finite, shrinking demand, maximizing volume is far more important than artificially propping up prices.
This isn't just about balance sheets, though. It is rapidly redrawing the security map of the entire Middle East. By ramping up cheap oil production, the UAE severely undercuts Iran, an adversary that relies heavily on premium energy exports to fund its regional activities. With oil prices suppressed, Tehran loses a massive amount of leverage. But the real diplomatic scramble is happening with the UAE's immediate neighbors. The reports note that Egypt has rapidly stepped in to intervene diplomatically, trying to mediate the explosive tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Meanwhile, Kuwait is reportedly in a state of high alarm. Sensing this rising instability and the collapse of traditional alliances, Kuwait actually dispatched an emergency delegation to Cairo to secure defense pacts and immediate military support. The entire region is visibly bracing for impact. You see, the security paradigm of the Middle East has completely inverted. Historically, Gulf nations relied heavily on collective defense bodies like the GCC and the Arab League to deter threats. But over the last few years, when Iranian-backed missiles targeted Gulf infrastructure, those regional organizations provided very little in the way of concrete defense. Instead, the UAE survived because of highly direct, bilateral backstops. Reading the defense reports, it is staggering to see that the U.S. engaged in direct security guarantees, and Israel actually deployed an Iron Dome battery onto Emirati soil during active combat. 10 years ago, that would have been completely unthinkable. The UAE realized they no longer need the political insurance of the OPEC bloc because they've successfully secured direct, hard power protection from the world's most capable militaries.
When you step back and look at the sheer scale of this disruption, it really makes you wonder. What happens to the global energy grid and the Middle East itself when the ultimate stabilizing cartel fractures forever? The old rules of energy economics and regional security, they're gone. The UAE has placed a massive, historic bet that the future belongs to flexible, diversified, high-volume producers rather than restrictive, old-world cartels. Whether the rest of OPEC can survive the structural earthquake is a story that will undoubtedly define the next decade. Thanks for exploring this fascinating shift with me on The Explainer. Keep an eye on those markets, and I'll see you next time as we continue to investigate the hidden systems that run our world.